when you've got 5 minutes left and 1 minute left, and let's really try to stick with the 15-minute framework if we can. So we'll start with a presentation from Marcos Bello and Carlos Parada.
A clicker. We should have one.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Let me start by saying how privileged I feel to be here and to be able to share this ongoing research that I and Carlos starting. We are halfway through it. Then we thought it would be an extraordinary setting for being able to get reactions to this research, and I'm really happy to be here. Our research, we have this interesting title, I think, strongly for big dog. That is the metaphor that we find most appropriate for our argument. And the idea is to explain the process of delegation of powers to check institutions. Brazil obviously was the focus of our initial research, and now we are extending it to cover Latin America, and we expected to have external validity and be able to capture the dynamics of check institutions in the separation of powers systems. So these two phenomena in Brazil that we learned yesterday, and I think most in the audience here are familiar with, which is the mensalão and the current Petrolão, the car wash operation, and so on, the motivation for the research. The mensalão scandal was this mega scandal some decade back now. This is the Supreme Court justices. I'm happy to say that Professor Barroso is not in the picture, neither in the Brazilian group here, nor in but this is a very nice a cartoon because it goes to the point. You know, we have seen the most powerful figure in Brazil, Dan, Lula's chief of staff and would-be president in the subsequent election. You know, in front of a bench. What is interesting in this context is that we have very powerful figure, the incumbents, being punished by an institution in which 8 of the 11 out of the 11 members had been appointed by the executive branch and of course approved subsequently by the Senate. So it is quite extraordinary what happened then. And what is interesting in terms of, which I think is crucial here, is the change in beliefs that sustain the current institutional change. By then, 73% of the Brazilians, 3 in 4, were absolutely convinced that those accused had reasons to be sanctioned. But only 1 in 10 thought by then, in 2005, so a decade ago, that some punishment would in effect take place. The second episode, the scandal, is the Petrolão, but in this case, as I said, it is truly extraordinary that the judicial losses was imposed on the incumbents. And this is even all the more surprising considering that presidents in Brazil are very powerful, are the most powerful, as we'll see in a minute, constitutionally speaking, in Latin America. The big oily is this vast scandal, a scheme involving very, very powerful figures, including a former president, the most popular in history, and as we know, also one of the most important Latin American entrepreneurs and wealthiest individuals, Marcelo Odebrecht. So the cast of characters are impressive. But what is interesting is that now 96%, this is figure for December 2016, supports the car wash investigation. 85% supports the investigation, even considering that it's hurting the economy. But what is really interesting is that 2/3 of the population thinks that the investigation will lead to punishment. So there's, in a decade, there's this vast change in beliefs. This incredible exposure explains the saliency in corruption. Currently, corruption is the #1 concern of Brazilians, even in a context where unemployment is at its peak. So what accounts for this? For the variation in the strength of checks and balances in Latin America? We see Brazil with this impressive case here, these two cases. So this is what we want to understand. The subsequent developments around the Odebrecht scandal in Latin America involving 14 countries obviously will be one of our one of the motivations also for an empirical focus of subsequent research, but why we have this variation, and we want to look at the variation, particularly in terms of what we call check institutions. So this ranges from parliamentary inquiry commissions to supreme audit institutions, like Contralorias and Tribunais de Contas, judicial institutions, and public ministries. So these are our 4 dependent variables. We have database on the first 2, extensive database, and we also have done case studies, but the focus of this presentation will be not on the Brazilian experience or showing evidence of variation in those dimensions. Our focus here is more theoretical. We want to present and have your reactions on our framework. So we draw on 2 literatures that have ignored each other. One is the literature on systems of governments, a variety of presidential systems, with a focus on why we have strong and weak presidents. And the other literature is the literature on the determinants of autonomous institutions, the focus being what explains judicial autonomy, but autonomy in general of a variety of institutions, from regulatory institutions to other institutions. So the first issue, why strong and weak presidents? Right? So the focus of this literature is on the building of a strong national power, executive power, and of course the dynamics involving the delegation of powers from assemblies to this national central authority. Historically, this has been called the medicine's dilemma. And in Latin America, we have what Sugar called a particularly violent form of Badson's dilemma, which is historically we have a very powerful president that abused power, and of course delegating powers to this president in democratic settings involves a dilemma that the president will abuse power, and therefore this dilemma involves an enhanced potential agency loss. This is what the dilemma of hyper-presidentialism. The other literature focus on the determinants of institutions, of autonomy of institutions, such as judiciary, tribunais de contas, etc. So that the main insights here is that when power is monopolized, there will be no incentives for check activity or checking executives. So there's by now a large literature that that has explored, particularly when the causal mechanisms that links power fragmentation and the emergence of independent institutions, power alternation, and the emergence of autonomous institutions, and also the causal mechanism here can be of various types, so we don't have the time to go into the details here. But basically, there are two main arguments involved, which is that when power is fragmented, we have coordination problems in the attack by the executive on autonomous institutions, and also all the causal mechanisms that's been explored, okay, which is associated with the political insurance company. So our framework draws on these two literatures and these insights, and we see the delegation of powers to presidents as a complement to the delegation of power to check institutions. Let me put it in a more organized way. Here we suggest that we only have strong check institutions and autonomy in a context where power is fragmented and the president constitutional powers are strong. So this is the basis of argument. I have to rush here because we don't have much time. And in the case of a country like Brazil, we have a multi-party system at the constitutional moment. So we look at the how the configuration of party configuration and also constitutional powers. What is this configuration at each constitutional moment? So we look at the various decades, and the resulting incentive structure leads to more delegation or to less delegation. But after there is this constitutional moment, we have a dynamics that may confirm or weaken, reinforce or weaken the delegation in constitutional moments. So we want to explain through case studies these various configurations. We have enough variation in our dependent variables. It's just illustrative. Here we have the vastly different configuration in each country in terms of powers of presidents. Some presidents have a variety of powers, whereas others, such as Venezuela pre-Chavez or the U.S., we have weak presidencies, and also in terms of the quality of audit institutions. So we explore that, and I've been rushing through because we don't have much time. This is our final exploratory empirical exercise. We look each information point there is a country with in a particularly point in time when a constitution was drafted. So we have Brazil here. In 46, Brazil here in 1988. We have Chile here in 1988. What we see here is that our dependent variable here is coded in a binary fashion, like strong checks and weak checks, and this idea that weak presidents and multi-party and governing coalitions, how they interact. There are 4 configurations, and this very preliminary data here suggests that our intuition is find some empirical backing here from the data. Our dependent variable, there is the rule of law indicator, the governance data will back governance indicator, and this is very exploratory. So just to finish here, what you want to have your reactions here is on the potential of this framework is a theory for exploring this variation in the strength of check and balance institutions. We have this framework has testable implications that we can test rigorously in future empirical papers. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. So next we'll have Frank Fukuyama telling us about too much rule of law.
Okay. Are my slides loaded on this? I'll leave that up to you, but I'll start talking in the meantime since there's not that much time. So I actually have 2 presentations. I have this one on too much rule of law, and then I actually have a separate one on anti-corruption strategies. I don't know how much time I'll have if I can get to the latter. Yeah, that's it. Okay, thank you. This one only has there are only 2 slides here. So we'll see how that works. So I'm not a Brazil expert, pretty obvious. But
you have been lately.
Hmm?
You have been lately.
This presentation actually follows quite logically from the previous one because I want to put rule of law in the context of larger questions of institutional design. Doing a presentation on too much rule of law, I find this hard in certain audiences to do this where you've got countries where the basic problem is insufficient checks on executive power, and I don't want to seem like I'm undermining the legitimacy or the necessity of doing this. So let me just preface this by saying I think it's great that Brazil has the kind of independent judiciary it does. Other countries in Latin America really need this, but I do think that it can also be problematic when judiciaries either get too strong or exceed the boundaries of what they're actually competent to do. So I think that you cannot look at a judiciary and its checking functions in isolation. You have to put it in the context of the design of the overall institutional system. In any liberal democracy, there are a variety of possible checks and balances that can exist. They can be legislative, whether the country has an upper chamber that has equal powers, the rules within the legislature, what kind of oversight powers it has. Federalism is another form of check, delegated powers to states, and municipal governments can check the federal government. The bureaucracy can be a check because if it's truly autonomous, it won't completely be under the control of its political masters, and it won't necessarily do what the executive wants. We're seeing an example of that with Donald Trump and the American intelligence community right now. So collectively, all of these institutions that are potential checks on executive power are veto points, and I think that you can think about political systems on a kind of linear scale from 0 veto points, which is a complete dictatorship, or where the tyrant or the dictator is the only possible veto point, to one that requires complete consensus from all of the different players. So this is just an example. So this comes from this Buchanan-Tulloch calculus of consent book, where this is voting in like a legislature, where on the x-axis you have the percentage of the population, relevant population that's necessary to make a decision, and then decision costs, that is to say the time and effort and so forth that's necessary to actually come to a decision. And it kind of rises exponentially the more veto points you have. And that's basically the fundamental dilemma in the design of a democratic political system, because you can have too many veto points. If it's too easy to stop things, then the government won't be able to make decisions. And I think the fundamental trade-off in the overall design of a political system is between what Cox and McCovens call decisiveness on the one hand, and resoluteness, or legitimacy on the other hand. Or my colleague Larry Diamond would say efficiency and governability on the one hand versus representativeness on the other. And there's actually no correct balance between the two, because these are competing goods. You cannot have complete representativeness if you actually want the government to make decisions. On the other hand, government makes decisions, some people aren't going to be happy, they're going to be left out, and this decision will not be representative. The other thing that I think you realize when you look at the judiciary in the context of the overall design of the system is that these checks can be traded off for one another. And there's actually alternative ways of checking executive power. So, for example, things can be done through a judiciary, but they can also be done through an administrative hierarchy. And, there's some functions, for example, I was struck by Judge Barroso's talking about the lawsuits, over your telephone bill. This is not something actually, so yeah, you can check abuses that way, but that's an awfully expensive way of doing it. Litigation is far more costly than doing it through an administrative hierarchy. And so, there are different ways of doing this. So I actually think that, if you think about optimality in terms of veto points, you get a curve something like this, that, too few of them is a problem, but too many of them is also a problem. And also, which veto points you select, I think make a great deal of difference in terms of the effectiveness of the overall political system. So let me just give you several examples of this, of cases in countries and democracies where you have what I've labeled vetocracy, meaning you've got so many veto points that you basically can't make decisions and things are stymied. One of them is India. So India, and actually a lot of my cases will come from things like building public infrastructure, because I think this is a perfect micro case of this larger governance problem, right? So building an electrical grid or a dam or a road system is a difficult matter in democratic decision making, because it is a public good that will benefit a broad, number of citizens, but it imposes concentrated losses on certain people, the people that have to give up their homes and land, in order to build the highway, and so forth. And so it's an area that generates a great deal of political controversy that has to be resolved through rules of the political system. And I think there's a lot of democracies that have not been able to build infrastructure because there's too many veto points. So India is a classic example of this. Indian court system is a total mess. So what's the backlog?
30 million, maybe. I mean, it's small compared to Brazil.
So 30 million cases. The Supreme Court itself has a backlog of 60,000, cases, which actually increases the discretionary ability of judges to just pick and choose, the cases that they want to do. But, anytime Delhi wants to build an airport, there's this huge fight because all of these checking institutions, come into play. So it's not just the legislature that doesn't want to appropriate the money, but then you get lawsuits and, mobilization by different civil society groups that use the legal system to block things. Second example, here in California, we don't build infrastructure here in California because we got too damn many veto points. I'll give you a very specific legal example. So under CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, which is the major umbrella state-level environmental protection act in California, this law gives standing to every single one of California's 40 million citizens to launch an anonymous lawsuit to block any particular infrastructure project that they don't like. Turns out that only about 11% of these lawsuits are actually launched by environmental groups. They're NIMBY neighbors, they are business competitors, they're labor unions that are having a fight with the company, and so they can stop stuff because of this broad standing. And then, so Justice Barroso's presentation, it seemed to me, was also a kind of illustration of this, where Brazil has this admirable judiciary that's standing up to abuses of executive power in terms of corruption, but it's also built on top of a judiciary that seems to me has flowed into other areas of the system where it's probably not the optimal institution, so something like managing the social security system. This is preeminently something that ought to be done by legislatures because it involves these complex, budgetary trade-offs where you have to reconcile different, competing goods against one another in a resource-constrained environment, and judicial institutions really are not, terribly suited to do that sort of thing. As I said, other things really should be taken care of in an administrative hierarchy. And so, that becomes problematic. Now, I think the reason that this sort of thing happens is because of weakness in other parts of the system. So in the case of Brazil, case of India, you get these hyperactive judiciaries that are substituting for other institutions in the system that are not doing their job. So legislatures not dealing with, pension reform. In the case of India, there's a major decision on environmental protection where basically the Supreme Court, in effect, began writing environmental law, and I think it's kind of a natural outcome of weakness in other parts of the system. South Africa, by the way, has also got this a similar system where the court. So South Africa, like Brazil, has this very extensive set of social rights, and because the legislature could not be relied on to actually provide a kind of housing and education and so forth that, poor citizens there need, the courts ended up taking on that responsibility. One final, so it's clear I'm not going to get to the corruption part of this, so let me just conclude. I do think that there is a relationship. So this builds directly off the previous presentation. Juan Lin. So I think a lot of this, the problems in Latin America actually stem from presidentialism. Presidentialism is another form of a check because power is split between the executive and the legislature. Both of them have equal democratic legitimacy because they're both popularly elected situation that does not exist in a parliamentary regime. Juan Linz wrote this article back in the 1990s based on the Chilean case, The Perils of Presidentialism, in which he suggested that the whole region might have been better off if they had had parliamentary systems. And the reason, I think, was kind of illustrated in the previous presentation, that presidential systems tend towards weakness because of this divided power. The president doesn't have a legislative majority, then they are tempted to go for emergency powers or to do things by executive order and so forth. And so you have this oscillation, actually, between an excessively checked and weak and indecisive system, and then a flipping over, like in Argentina, just delegating to the president, the power to make the budget every year. I mean, it's crazy, but it kind of stemmed from the weakness of the legislative majority of a lot of presidents in Argentina, and then the excessive powers of the president then make you want to flip back in the other direction because those powers are abused. We're seeing this in the United States. You have this deadlock in our system between Obama and a Republican-controlled Congress. After 2010, they could not get anything passed through normal legislative channels. So what does Obama do? He starts doing everything by executive order. We have now Republican control. Turns out that even when the Republicans control both houses of Congress and the presidency, they can't do stuff either. So what does President Trump do? He reverts to executive order. So I sort of think that the United States is actually being Latin Americanized in many respects with regard to the nature of its presidential system. But so I guess the final conclusion is that there's a connection between the weakness and the strength, that neither of these poles is a good place to be at. And therefore, there's always this kind of political dynamic that wants to push you over in the other direction, and then you overcorrect, when that happens. And the thing is that you actually want to be somewhere in the middle. Much better to be somewhere in the middle. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next we have Eric Jensen, titled Separating Power and the Global Rule of Law Recession.
Sarah, can you give me a hand? So as Sarah's setting up,
what is the address?
This presentation went through 3 very quick lives. When we met with Carlos and Alberto about the conference, I just thought I'd do something off the shelf on a rule of law recession paper that Dinshaw Mistry and I are working on. And then I started to learn more about Brazil. I'm not a Brazil expert either. And I thought, well, Brazil is an outlier country because it's not a part of this rule of law recession. So part of my presentation today will be about all the good things that Brazil should be feeling at this time, even though domestically you may not be. So separating power and countering corruption, some comparative thoughts. I'm going to draw a little bit during a part of this presentation on some of Indonesia's counter-corruption experience and raising some questions. I'm much better at raising questions in this presentation with this audience than I am in answering them. So this is my Stephen Jobs-esque sort of outline about modernization, separation, disruption, and then consolidation, question mark. Modernization. So the story yesterday that Justice Barroso told us was a story that could fit very easily in rule of law and modernization and countries becoming more wealthy and judiciaries becoming more separate and more highly specified role of the judiciary. Paul Brest and I are leading a project, and Frank is involved in it, Dinshaw is involved in it, Alberto, on the rule of non-law, which I rather like as a counterintuitive project based at Stanford Law School. We've got several hypotheses at work. One is that formal legal institutions are not important to economic growth and development at early stages of development, and indeed may delay industrialization. Second, that at early stages of development, business actors are often use poorly functioning legal regimes to their advantage until complexity of economies reduces those advantages and obfuscates winners and losers. And third, that workarounds to the legal system do not, sorry, I did this at 11:30 last night, do not entail higher transaction costs. So law is frequently treated as a neutrally fixed endowment, a technical input, but we, the political scientists in the audience, the economists in the audience tend to know that it's not a technical input only. Law arises from human interaction that is dependent on political system, law and market development, and highly iterative process of action and reaction. One thing that really interests me about Carlos and Marcus's paper is this idea that 96% of Brazilians are all in on the judicial action, and 65% expect convictions. You know, this demand for law and legal institutions, an observation of both. Obviously, this is on your right is Adam Smith, and on your left is Karl Marx. I'm kidding. But you know, as markets grow in size and complexity and economic actors become more diverse, demand for law appears to grow. That's the modernization story. So when do courts matter? Well, at some stage, autonomous courts with significant degree of autonomy become important to allow a regime to make credible commitments in the economic sphere. So independent, autonomous, third-party monitoring becomes an important function, but when and how? Well, in this Rule of Non-Law project, we're trying to come to grips with when that event happens. Jaworski back in the 90s did this study on democracy. When you reach 6,000 GDP per capita, I think, what is it now, 10,000 GDP per capita, there isn't a backsliding from democracy to authoritarian regime. In looking at Rule of Law Recession, which is, we're writing it as a compatible paper to Larry Diamond's Journal of Democracy article of 2015, we see that you know, economic development, even with economic development, you've got serious recession in rule of law. I just point out Poland and Hungary here. But you would expect the rule of law to just continue to grow with the modernization story. So we've got the modernization story in Brazil's counter-corruption story. Long history of pervasive corruption. Then we've got a judicial spurt, 1988 to 2004 and 2004 onward. The two cases that Marcus mentioned. Last night, Justice Barroso mentioned that there are allies of miscreants. And these allies of miscreants go deep in society. And this is what I find puzzling. How far can the judiciary go with a deep network of miscreants before they go too far? I'm just not sure. Separation. I'm really encouraged that in most of my world, 40 developing countries that I've worked in, most of which have not achieved Brazil's level of development, but I've been beset by rule of law consultants who drop into countries and say, no, this is how power must be separated. Based on God knows what, their preconceived ideas of their optimal institutions. With this group, I don't have to talk about how separating power is a dynamic experiment. But for most of my career, I avoided larger constitutional questions because I thought, man, there's just nothing that I have to say or can do that might fix basic problems and larger issues with the separation of powers and judicial independence. I did a 10-country study on judicial independence across Asia about 13 years ago, and concluded that none of these countries really had a very high level of judicial independence. I saw many, many projects that had as an ultimate goal strengthening judicial independence. Most of those projects were utter failures. So I decided, I'm a guy who, the world likes home runs, but I'm very comfortable batting bunts that I can see make a difference. So I backed off of working too much on judiciaries because I also didn't see a lot of social and economic change coming from the judicial performance in countries that I was working on. So the rule of law recession paper, about which I'm not going to speak much except to the extent it doesn't apply to Brazil, really comes out of this concern about growing practices, autocratic practices from developing world and developed world, and with growing use of judiciaries as instruments through which to achieve greater autocratic power. I became more interested in the role of judiciaries. Now, Gerhard Casper has a few, Gerhard is a colleague of ours at the Center on Democracy, Development, Rule of Law, and former president of Stanford and former dean of University of Chicago Law School. He wrote in a book entitled Separating Power, Essays on the Founding Period, barren assertions of its, that is, separation of powers importance, however, do not capture the complexity of the matter. No consensus existed as to the precise institutional arrangements that would satisfy the requirements of the doctrine. The only matter on which agreement existed, that is, back at the founding period, was that it meant not to have separation of powers. It meant tyranny. The U.S. Constitution, Brazil's 1988 Constitution, are versions of what Gerhard calls an uncertain doctrine. And that, I would suggest, is the experiment that Brazil is very much involved in today. The balance that interests me is political scientists are always concerned about rule of law's constraint on the exercise of power by political actors. But, there is a possibility that, focusing on what Montesquieu is actually concerned about may be a concern as well, judicial overreach. I'm going to carry on. So these are problems that Brazil doesn't have. As Justice Barroso talked about yesterday, the appointments process works well. You've got a meritocracy, which you rarely see to the extent that Brazil has installed. You've got capacity, highly educated and trained judges and prosecutors. You don't have a need for an international intervention like CICIG in Guatemala, and you've got extraordinary public demand. These are things that are usually problematic in rule of law recession countries. I was really struck yesterday by Justice Barroso's account of idealistic, well-educated young professionals joining the judiciary and prosecutorial services through meritocratic exams. I'm just wondering about this group of relatively virtuous people and their capacity to fight against a deep network of allies of miscreants. So you've got an evolving role of judges in Brazil. Clearly, the judiciary is doing more than calling balls and strikes, as our current U.S. Chief Justice described his job as a judge. Marty Shapiro of Berkeley Law School wrote a piece in a Harvard Law and Policy journal some years ago, short piece entitled Judges as Liars. That is, rule of law, to the extent that the concept is intended to mean that judges apply only pre-existing law, can never exist. Judges often make rules for decision of future cases and are therefore making law. And I see, and perhaps Justice Barroso could comment on this, some adoption of looking at the consequences of decisions, judicial consequentialism. Outcomes should be consistent with the purposes and intents of law, which give judges some room to roam. But where is Brazil in the spectrum between separation of powers and when will it be viewed by the polity as judicial overreach? When is it time to make a deal? Is an elite pact forthcoming? And just very briefly on disruption. I just included this slide because I read a book recently that actually quoted Milton Friedman, and I thought this is really a good quote. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around, or I would say institutions that are lying around, in Brazil's case. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. And I think that's a part of what's being described here in the political crisis in Brazil. I don't really have time to get into the Indonesia story much, but I am struck there was a law that was passed in 2004 that gave the Counter-Corruption Commission in Indonesia a lot of power. It was supported by the president initially, supported by the parliament initially. Like Brazil, civil society, media was alive on the corruption issue. It developed a capacity within the formal legal institutions to handle corruption commission cases, and the Corruption Commission had high capacity and broad investigative powers. Its budget was not affected as it went after what I would call middle fish. But just recently, the Counter-Corruption Commission has been populated by activists who went after the Speaker of the Parliament, a good friend of Donald Trump, Novanto. And I worry that the KPK may have gone after too big a fish. Now, Brazil doesn't have this problem. Brazil's gone after huge fish. And that's why Steve Krasner raised the issue of judicial security going after such big fish. Because in Indonesia, the predictable thing happened. KPK commissioner was physically attacked. The budget may be reduced. With Novanto out, the ruling coalition may fall, and the old Golkar Guard may come in. If Golkar wins, that's President Suharto's party, it may try to dismantle the KPK altogether. So I look at Brazil, and I mean at Indonesia, and I say, whoa, I can see the consequences of going after big fish, and their predictable consequences. And I wonder why those predictable consequences have not befallen Brazil. Consolidation. That's why I asked the question last night, you know, when will a deal be struck? And I just had to end with Woody Allen. Justice Barroso, I've never heard a justice of the Supreme Court quoting Woody Allen. And I thought this was good, Woody Allen's match point on luck or overwhelming contingencies. I once wanted to write a book on overwhelming contingencies because much of my life looking at things in developing countries, I've wondered, boy, things just pop up. And maybe these two huge cases that popped up in Brazil were a tipping point, but maybe that tennis ball is going to get stuck at the net. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our last presentation is from Bill Summerhill on parliamentary sovereignty and emergence of ministerial responsibility.
Thanks. So Jonathan gives me 15 minutes. That was news. Carlos will tell me 20 minutes. I'm going to do the best I can. So I'm Bill Summerhill. I'm a historian. I'm a real outsider here. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a professor of law. I don't lie here. I'm very intimidated by them.
That's a really short talk.
But, yeah. I saw Vinicius Motos coming. Vinicius is an outsider too. He's a sociologist, so then I felt better. I said, okay, I'll do it. Frank Fukuyama talked about a situation. He used California as a great example in which there's too much balance of power. There's too many constraints on the executive. There's too many veto points. My wife does city attorney work. They get slaughtered by CEQA law in California every day. I'm going to talk about the polar opposite. I'm going to talk about Brazil when it didn't have balance of powers, right? When it didn't have enough constraints on the executive, and then discuss circumstance of situation in which it goes to having constraints on the executive and how it got there. So checks and balances. Hey, constraints on the executive are really important. They establish these veto points like Frank described. Veto points in the policy space. They limit arbitrary discretion by the executive branch of government or by a monarch in a situation you were going from some sort of absolute monarchy to a situation like a constitutional monarchy. They matter for the rule of law because they are the law, right? When you're going from that initial situation of autocracy to one of trying to establish checks and balances. They create the foundation for non-autocratic government. How these constraints on the executive come about, how they're created, this is a historical question. For Brazil in 1988, we all have a good notion of how they came about. I want to talk about how they came about in Brazil in the 1820s, believe it or not. Comparative political scientists sometimes will use a data set that categorizes political regimes, something called polity fore. I don't know if political science uses this, right? Yeah. But polity fore codes 19th century Brazil as an autocracy with no constraints on the executive. Right? Bernardo Guimarães at Fundação Getúlio Vargas in São Paulo brought this to my attention. He says, you know, the argument you're making doesn't sound like polity fore. And I'm like, what is this polity fore? What does it say? And he says, there's no constraints on the executive. And I said, that's wrong. So pretty much my presentation is not the principal motivation. My presentation today is why polity fore is wrong in this characterization of Brazil. Why is Brazil interesting? Hey, Brazil is an important case. It's the only place in Latin America that's politically stable after independence. Every place else in Latin America either falls apart, descends in the decades of civil war, becomes completely dysfunctional. Every place else in Latin America that has a sovereign debt defaults on the sovereign debt before the end of the 1820s. Some of those countries default on debt over and over and over again in the 19th century. Brazil never defaults on its debt in the 19th century. There's something about the political institutions that are created in Brazil after independence that are pretty different than what you find in the rest of Latin America. So I want to talk about where this system comes from. Everybody knows why checks and balances are important. Montesquieu up to Cox and Weingast day before yesterday. So how to think about this problem of checks and balances in Brazil? The way I approach it is a simple model. It's a caricature of models about how sovereigns end up giving up authority to elites in places in Europe. It's a caricature for Europe, but it actually works really well for early 19th century Brazil. If you think about there's an emperor or an executive branch, and there's an elite, and they want to bargain over two dimensions. They want to bargain over the tax rate, and they want to bargain over control of policy. This generates a fairly straightforward constraint optimization model. Coming out of all that gibberish is classic trade-off. To get more taxes, to get higher tax revenue, the ruler has to give up some control over policy. The problem with these kinds of bargains is that the ruler is uniquely sovereign, can engage in ex post opportunism, right, can renege on any deal right, after he receives the taxes, deprive the elite of their control of policy, and so the deal itself is not credible. The elite's not foolish, they understand the sovereign's uniquely sovereign, and so they never enter into the deal to begin with. So this makes, in another vocabulary, the cost of transacting between an emperor like Brazil has and the elite very, very high, and transactions can't really take place politically until something changes. So this is a wonderful picture. I know political scientists love these kinds of pictures. This is an Edgeworth box, right? Very simple. It's got two dimensions, right? Here's the tax rate. Tax rate can run from 0 on out to whatever. T star is the revenue maximizing tax rate. It's where the emperor would like to be to get his most. It's like the top of the Laffer curve. The vertical axis is control over policy. At the bottom, the emperor controls policy. At the top, the elite controls policy. The emperor would like to be over here, maximizing tax revenues and in total control of policy. The elite, owners of capital, property owners, they'd like to be here, where the tax rate's really low, and that they control policy. You can think about an initial equilibrium, initial set of circumstances we'll call A, down here, where the tax rate is this, the emperor's policy control is almost to the max. Right? Let there be a shock, like a war, in which the emperor needs more revenue. The emperor is going to have to give up something to get more revenue. He's going to give up policy control to the elite to get more taxes. Any point to the northeast of point A is a better place to be for both the elite and the emperor. They should bargain their way into this space, this lens, and efficiently they'd be along this contract curve in this segment. Because the emperor is uniquely sovereign, and he can renege on the deal and can receive the taxes, you don't stay at B. The emperor's going to go to C. There's a commitment problem that the elite understand, and so there's a social surplus that they cannot realize, they cannot transact with each other, they cannot get to a good type of point like B. So how can we support a point like B? You could create an institution, a rule, right, that generates a surplus by coming to an agreement on how to divide it. The institution has to make this ex post opportunism on the part of the emperor very costly to the emperor. If not, it doesn't work. Right? So a prediction, any sort of exogenous shock that creates a higher demand for revenue on the part of the emperor should lead to a search for an institutional solution that gets you to a point like B in that Edgeworth box, and that's exactly what we observed in 1820s Brazil. This is visual distraction at this point. This is the emperor. The emperor is the central figure in this. I'm not a monarchist. You don't have to be a monarchist to appreciate this is a very sharp jacket. It looks like that was painted from Gloria or Takechi somewhere based on the background. All right, I don't use wars as just a kind of a stylized fact. Brazil has wars in the 1820s, right? It has several types of wars. One type of war is the Northeast trying to break away. This happens in 1817. It happens again in 1824. It's a persistent risk to the regime and to the territorial integrity of Brazil. Brazil also has a conflict with Portugal and independence. Major combat operations are over by the end of 1823, but Portugal continues to threaten to try to revoke Brazil's independence. They can even disrupt Brazil's access to the London capital market in 1824 with these threats. That's not resolved until the treaty between Portugal and Brazil, the Treaty of Peace and Friendship. It sounds like a California thing in the 60s, right? Settles the war. And then Pedro's going to go to war with Buenos Aires over the Cisplatine province in the south. All these wars are really expensive. Brazil is independent without a regular army and without a regular navy. It has a militia, but it has to create all this military capacity quickly in the 1820s. It costs a lot more money than current tax revenues. They need access to capital markets to do this. So it's actual war that's creating the shock that leads the emperor to seek out higher tax revenues. During these periods of conflict, there's a sequence of institutional changes. First, there's a Constituent Assembly in 1823. So the emperor is constitutional from the time he's acclaimed emperor in 1822, even though there's no constitution. They have to come up with a constitution now. The proposed constitution is not tripartite. It fuses powers. It's a parliamentary type of system. It makes the parliament and the emperor representatives of the nation. It makes them co-sovereign. But it reduces dramatically the scope of the emperor's authority. The emperor doesn't like that, so he uses the army to shut down the Constituent Assembly. That looks like it's going to be the end right there. It's not. His advisors take the draft of the Constitution, they keep it largely intact, and they add to it a fourth branch of government known as the moderating power. The moderating power gives the emperor uniquely several authorities. One of the most important ones is that the emperor freely chooses his ministers. The cabinet does not emerge from a legislative majority. The cabinet is appointed by the emperor. And the cabinet is only accountable to the emperor. Does this get us to point B in the diagram? It does not. Sovereignty is still uniquely residing with the emperor in a particular kind of way. person of the emperor is inviolable, the emperor is unimpeachable. Explicitly in the Constitution, he cannot be held responsible for his actions as emperor. Ministers are responsible for their actions in government, but only to the emperor. Thanks, Jonathan. That says 10, right? So we can't get to point B. The Constitution of 1824 separates powers, but does not solve the commitment problem. It's going to take something else to solve the commitment problem to get to point B. So the first parliamentary session is 1826. The lower house of parliament has a series of constitutional type grievances against the emperor from the very opening. They summon the ministers to appear and to report to this elected lower house on the activities and circumstances of their ministry. All the ministers except one are senators. They refuse. They don't show. They don't have to. The Constitution says they're responsible to the emperor, not to the parliament. So they quickly pass a bill of ministerial responsibility that establishes criminal penalties for their advice. So the way this works is that the lower house is going to interpret the actions of the emperor as bad advice by his ministers, and then have a criminal procedure in the lower house against the ministers. So this raises the cost to the emperor of that ex post opportunism. The emperor's closest advisors can go to jail. The first version of these proposals had death penalty in them, things like that. That comes out of it, right? But there's a criminal set of penalties that the lower house can use against the cabinet ministers. Bernardo Pereira de Vasconcelos, who was an ardent liberal, one of the leaders in the lower house, summed it up perfectly, better than the Edgeworth box does. Without ministerial responsibility, there is no constitution. The emperor clearly doesn't like this proposal. He doesn't want to give up his authority under the Constitution over the ministers. So the lower house says, no problem. You don't get a budget for 1826 or 1827. You've got to run with the kind of money you've been running with. We're not going to give the emperor a budget in the midst of this big war. Right? The lower house says we're not going to accept the crown debt as a public debt. Not our problem. The crown undertook that debt. Loans in London, loans in Rio de Janeiro. There's a separate problem with the Bank of Brazil. There's a Bank of Brazil at the time that basically uses an inflation tax to finance the emperor's expenditures. In the midst of a war, Pedro basically capitulates. He says, okay, he approves this law in which his ministers can be tried criminally for his actions if they're deemed unconstitutional by the lower house. This creates the kind of political penalty for the emperor that he was trying to avoid, but which makes his own promises credible. Once the emperor sanctions this law, then the lower house says, okay, now we'll give you money. But we get control, we have influence over the ministers, we help determine whether or not Brazil's at war, everything else that Brazil might do. And they approve a budget for the emperor. It's just all just social science flim-flammery. It's just this is one of these modeling exercises. It's a joke. Social scientists, right? It's just a modeling exercise. No, this actually works. In 1829, a couple of ministers were going to be brought up on charges in the lower house of parliament because of things that happened. Details not in court right now. And rather than have them tried and convicted by the lower house, the emperor agrees to fire them. So this criminal penalty under the law of ministerial responsibility becomes, for the next 65 years, a political penalty with a tool. It takes the form of motions of no confidence in cabinets. That's how Brazil got its first constraints on the executive. Thank you.
That was 14 minutes.
Was it?
Yes.
Coffee.
So Alberto will make some comments, and then we'll invite everyone to the.
Okay. So this is going to be hard. I need to comment on 4 very substantive presentations, and I obviously had to be taking notes and thinking a little bit about and absorbing what the various speakers were talking about. So I will try mostly to to make sense of a couple of things that at least to me seem to be some of the more important theoretical questions that we have to address rather than about the case of Brazil or specific cases. And I will try to, in some way, hopefully, detonate a little bit of the conversation and discussion we'll have afterwards. We'll proceed a little bit in reverse order, mostly because of a historical kind of, bend, I think, in trying to think about these things from the origin. So I will talk a little bit about Bill Summerhill's presentation first, and mostly, one of the things I want to highlight is he used this device of the Edgeworth box to think about the bargaining problem between kind of emperor and let's call them the notables or the kind of moneyed elites or whoever these powerful players that want policy concessions really are. And this is a very, as he pointed out, a very important standard way to think about this problem, in European history, in political science. And it seems to me that one of the things that when he showed that, he opened kind of the way to really think about the different dimension of what he has in that box. So in that box, this is a two-player game. It's a game over bargaining, over a surplus. Both of them want to get to that surplus. He points out the problem of credibility in any commitment that the emperor makes. The emperor can always, renege on whatever he has agreed to do. But let's think a little bit for a second, how we tend to think about those bargaining games these days. One of the ways that we think of them in modern bargaining theory is about what kind of temporal horizon the political leaders, let's say the emperor, has. So the emperor thinks he will be in office until he dies, and he thinks he will actually have his son succeed him. So that's kind of the temporal horizon of a governor, of that kind of player. Very long, presumably very patient, very willing to sort of wait until, he tires the other player to just give concessions and let him put whatever tax rates he wants. Of course, this emperor, 1808, he's escaping from Europe. So his temporal horizon might actually be very short, if he thinks his life is at risk. So there's something about how we think of this institutional crafting, whenever these opportunities come up, whether, what kind of temporal horizon the different players have and what kind of, temporal visions are induced by the political system itself. So to what extent are the players going to think about this kind of career or motive or some kind of long-term legacy that they want to establish, and why that security of tenure in some ways or possibilities of re-election, etc., are so important, or careers within a party system that is relatively stable are so important to think about how this institutional crafting can actually take place. It's very difficult, I think, to think these institutional innovations that create checks and balances can emerge in systems that are very unstable, where uncertainty about the future is very large. The second possibility, and this is, I happen to be a rare person who has actually read Edgeworth. It's actually very difficult to read, but he does have these diagrams in his 1880s publication on this. And Edgeworth, what he's particularly interested is not just the box itself, but he really wants to think about what happens with this bargaining problem, when you start having additional players that come into the game. So his question is, what happens when it's not just two playing about this kind of division of this, point that will get us all into a better off situation? What happens when there's a third one, or there's a fourth one, there's a fifth one? And he extends this all the way to, a competitive market, and a lot of players that are competing over the surplus. And what he demonstrates is that as you get more players into it, these players actually make it feasible that you can go into this contract curve, which is where everyone is better off, and that deviations from that are strategically not viable, that no one should want to deviate from that movement towards this contract curve. So there's a virtue, and I would sort of connect this with things like federalism. So I think it's no wonder that some of these players were actually senators that in some way would have a territorial interest in representing a space of some political authority or some political autonomy. And in a way, going to one of the things Frank mentioned, things like federalism might actually be very important to think about how you get these kind of deals be played out when it is not really just one player that is it's not just a president bargaining with a legislature, it's actually a series of players that are bargaining together. Or the other possibility is that we think about kind of policy arenas, that if we have, for example, ministerial responsibility that goes over different portfolios, as those ministerial responsibilities are policy areas that are kind of multidimensional. It's not just one policy that is being established, but actually there's a policy for agriculture, but there's a policy for national defense, and there's a policy for trade, and each of these policy areas might actually open up spaces to create these institutional innovations. Okay, so let me go now to a different question, which is a little bit related to something that Eric said in his presentation. And you know, again, I cannot do justice to the nuance and the series of things that he told us, but one of the things that really struck me is that when he kind of plays on this contrast between sort of what Larry Diamond has been working on, this idea of that there is this democracy has stalled, or maybe even some reversal in the way we see it, and whether there is this same kind of phenomenon happening in rule of law. One of the complicated problems that I think his framework points out is that it is not so obvious how to measure rule of law scales and how to think about these rule of law indexes. To a large extent, I think we more or less have got to a point where political scientists more or less agree. You know, some people don't like Freedom House a lot, but still, even with all its defects, you know, or polity might not be the most preferred, you know, scale. But we mostly have got to a point where we agree quite a bit on, you know, these scorings, and we more or less know that these scorings are telling us something quite significant. I don't think we have that in the rule of law realm, and I think part of what, you know, Eric's sort of presentation really opens up is how difficult it is. I mean, it's this idea that we can agree what is tyranny, but it's actually very hard to figure out what is actually a check on balance, and a system that is more or less working in a reasonable manner. Because in some ways, you know, I'm thinking, for example, the World Justice Project, for example, when they try to do this very systematic effort to create a rule of law scoring across the world, they end up resorting, for example, to perceptions. And as you go into perceptions, then you start opening up this whole thing of, well, what do citizens think that rule of law is? Or what do they, you know, gauge as kind of a reasonable arrangement? And that is no longer about kind of the institutional nature of how we create some rules and establish, you know, limits on power through those institutional rules. So, so there's, you know, there's a couple of more things that I could say about this, but I think this really, you know, highlights a very important question of, you know, when we use these metrics, how do we know that Brazil is in a particular place today, or how do we know that comparative to other Latin American countries, it is, you know, at a higher position or a lower position in terms of this rule of law institutions? Which gets me into Francis Fukuyama's presentation, and here what I really, you know, I think I find really fascinating is this idea that in a way we, you know, too much rule of law, but it's also this idea that there is this substitution effect. The institutional substitution is one of the things that really struck me on what he, you know, what he tried to kind of press as a theoretical problem. So the theoretical problem, you know, he pointed out there is always this kind of, in Latin America at least, it seems to me that there's always this discussion about the power of presidents. So presidentialism always seems to be one of the first things where we start in any discussion. But then we also have, for example, recent work. I'm thinking, you know, one of the most interesting things I've read in the last year is this book by Michael Albertus on land reform in Latin America. And what Mike demonstrates is that there are so many veto players in democracy in Latin America that that's why you don't observe this idea that with democratization you would have a lot of land reform. So these kind of redistributive efforts that are presumably, like in the models, the Meltzer-Richards model of kind of median voter, you would move into huge land redistribution with democracy. That doesn't happen because, in a way, what he shows is autocrats are the ones who have more capacity to do things like redistribution than Democrats, because Democrats are subject to so many veto points. So, in a way, you know, one of the things that I think we really have to think a little bit harder is about how, you know, these veto players play on their different arenas. At the very least, I think, for example, one of the insights that I got from his presentation is budgets seem to be quite different from other policy areas. You know, we can think about, so he was making the examples about Social Security administration and questions about how you allocate the monies in a budget. There seems to be this kind of, at least to me, that we can think of rights as something that should really be done in the legislature and adjudicated by courts. We can think about, some politically contentious, questions where left and right might really divide. But the day-to-day question of how a budget, how, a resource-constrained kind of executive has to act and make some decisions about, the looming government shutdown in the U.S. Right now, for example, those kinds of decisions really require a bureaucracy that is professionalized, that in some ways is able to make all those decisions through some forms of delegation. And then end of the year, we can use an accounts tribunal, we can check how all the money was spent, and we can use voters as a way of punishing or showing kind of responsibility for what has happened. Final thing, and this is, again, maybe some of my own, interest in these things. It seems to me that we have tended, as these political scientists, to have a very institutional, static view of how these strategic games of checks and balances and division of powers and control over the abuse by the executive work. And the way I think of it is that this is not just static in the way we think about how strategies play out in a given moment in time, but it's also about how voters form beliefs about how those games will actually play. So to me, the paper by Marcus Melo and Carlos, what it really shows is this idea that the expectations and the beliefs over punishment and about how the game will end up being played later on down the tree. So this is not just about whether someone is indicted or some scandal breaks out. It is about the question of how these processes will be played out, and we seem to have almost in the language of game theory that right now in Latin America, in most countries, what we have is what game theorists call a pooling equilibrium. There is no informational value in the signal of when somebody says this person is being accused of corruption, because after all, we just assume as citizens that everyone is corrupt. All the politicians are corrupt. We have no way to really kind of discriminate between types. And if we cannot discriminate between types, then everyone in the political system is corrupt. This is something, for example, Miriam Golden, I don't know if she will talk about this later on, but she has pointed out that a lot of the economics research, for example, on corruption, makes this assumption that all we need to do is give voters information about the fact that politicians are corrupt. And what she says is, listen, voters know that politicians are corrupt. The informational value is not really very high. But the question is really about discriminating types, knowing whether there's good apples and bad apples. And the problem is that if we don't have this kind of, in the way beliefs and strategies work together, it is very difficult to create what is in game theory called a separating equilibrium. An equilibrium in which you would be able to use this information as a voter and know that this person is in some ways a corrupt politician, and this other one is not a corrupt politician, and we can actually reward that politician. And I think that dynamic of beliefs and strategies is something we really don't understand very well. But these are incredibly fascinating presentations. I'm very happy that we're kicking off with these discussions, and hope we can continue the conversation. Thank you.
I think the plan is now to have all the authors come and sit up here, and I think it would make sense, and Alberto, maybe you could stay up here too, and I think it makes sense for me to try to direct traffic toward the different authors. All right, questions?
I do.
All right.
And, something that has, in my mind for quite a while is exactly this discussion between too much veto versus and get things done, right? And the way I see Latin America in the 20th century is that we had already too many vetoes over there, right? But the way Latin America decided to overcome problems of getting things done was to delegate lots of powers to the president all over the land. So all over the land, with very few exceptions, president became really strong, right? So, and we solved governability problems. So democracy is the only game in town. So we don't have, problems anymore of democratic breakdowns in the land. So, but the next problem is, okay, what are we gonna do with this big guy now? So how can we avoid that this big guy would misbehave? What Marcus and I is trying to say is that, you know what? And we legislators are incompetent and incapable of, oversight or controlling this big guy, because this guy has so many devices to come after me. So the retaliation cost is too high. So what would be the best solution to this problem? All right, let's gonna delegate this task to non-political checks and balance institutions. So let's create a web of accountability institutions capable of controlling this big guy. So if he mess up, we're gonna be ready to give him a big no. So of course that we run the risk of, by delegating powers to judges and public prosecutors, that they also misbehave or they make mistakes. But the crucial moment that Latin America faces nowadays is that, in my view, that it pays off to run that risk, right? We are in a critical moment and we would be better off running the risk that checks and balance institution make some mistakes than providing some leeways for this big guy to get things done according to their way.
Seemed more like a comment than a question, but
That's
somebody might have a response, and I'll give them an opportunity.
Well, I know since Carlos was looking at me the whole time.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I agree with you completely. So I don't want you to interpret what I was saying as a criticism of this shift, towards these constraints of the big guy. What I was simply saying was, A, you can go a little bit too far in that direction, but also you need to think carefully about which checks are the most appropriate, and judicial checks are not necessarily the best thing. So, for example, one check, potential check, would actually be to professionalize bureaucracy, to make it autonomous of the, political masters. Brazil has actually done that to some extent. So if you look at the finance ministry, central bank, you actually have really high quality institutions. Other parts of the government are, not as good. But that's also another type of check, and it's actually probably a more effective way of governing than letting the judiciary, take on some of those functions. So that's the kind of point I was trying to make, is that, you need to think carefully about, yes, you do want to distribute these powers, you do want to check the big guy, but are courts, the right institution to do it in all of these different policy areas?
Okay, Ben, I think you were.
Just one brief point. I think there's a conceptual problem often when we talk about judiciaries, and this plays off of Frank's point. I have a whole lecture on separating power between the bureaucracy and the judiciary. And frequently, a lot of the things that Justice Barroso was mentioning yesterday, as Frank indicated, there are things that should be handled by the bureaucracy and not necessarily the judiciary. And a lot of congestion problems arise from the failure to appreciate that a lot of things can be handled by bureaucracies. Holland has a no contest divorce law that requires a judicial approval. And the Dutch are smart. The Dutch get up one day and say, there's no reason to have a no contest divorce handled by the judiciary. We're going to push it off to the bureaucracy. And there are many questions like that the bureaucracy should be handling rather than the judiciary.
Yeah, I think this is, I guess, mostly a question for Marcus and Carlos, but maybe other panels have some ideas as well. And it's we've talked a lot, and the presentations were mostly about sort of interinstitutional arrangements. One institution's checking the power of another, but to me, the figure that still hangs in the air is this 96% public opinion approval that's outside of these institutions. And so I wonder if you have more ideas about how we should think about what's the pressure of this public opinion and how does it feed into these relations across the institutions. And I think, sometimes you think, well, this could mean you go against public opinion, it could mean people in the streets, it could mean that the press will somehow attack back, that there'll be electoral consequences. So I just wonder how we should think about this. And I think, in Brazil, you've seen several attempts in Congress to say, look, okay, let's just say Caixa Dois is fine. We won't be able to anybody be prosecuted on that. And then it gets pulled back the next day. And you think, oh, well, maybe this is electoral consequences. But if these are people in Congress thinking we could end up in jail, then maybe that's worse than not being reelected. So anyway, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how this matters to institutions.
Yeah, we distinguish two stages, right? We identify two stages. One is the stage which we call a constitutional moment, when there is delegation of powers. Take the case of Brazil 1988. There was massive delegation of powers to checking institutions. The Supreme Court has vast powers, unequal powers. The same applies to the audit institutions. There's an array of prerogatives and so on that you don't find elsewhere. The same with the public ministry, which is extremely powerful, is a fourth. Is completely autonomous, decentralized, so there's no parallel. So what you want to understand that why there was such a degree of delegation of powers to these institutions. So this is the first stage. The second stage is that this arrangement or this delegation can be undermined because of a variety of factors, right? And that includes, let me put the reverse. This has been sustained, not undermined, because there has been a strong competition between two camps. So despite the overall fragmentation, there was this very robust competition between the Workers' Parties-led coalition and the PSDB-led coalition. So this political competition was crucial to sustain this delegation of power. Because if we had a concentration of power in one side, presumably that delegation of powers those institutions would be weakened over time. So one thing is political competition. It is crucial to sustain that. And the other thing is beliefs that sustain this self-enforced equilibrium. So beliefs is also a crucial aspect of the second stage. Otherwise, attacks on these institutions would be made, and they will have succeeded. That's what so unlike other countries in Latin America, Brazil, there was this sustained level of political competition. That was really, and power alternation, to the point that there was power alternation. And the margin of victory has always been over the incumbents versus rivals. Has always been very slim, and unlike Argentina, for example, or if you want. And that is what really has sustained this equilibrium that we see today, where these institutions are very, very proactive and strong.
But if it's, well, just to follow, so if competition then may have that function, and you don't need the public opinion behind it.
Yeah, I think they are components. And the fact that we have, as Professor Fukuyama has stressed, a strong federalism. So even if you're out of power and you control a strong state like, a big state like Sao Paulo or Minas, you're not out of the game. So the Brazilian political system is decentralized to the point that it's very difficult to the executive to wield unrivaled power. There's always some state, big state, that is controlled by the opposition. So I see it as complements.
This is also a question to Carlos and Marco's paper, but maybe also for other panelists. So I think you pointed out correctly that there is this tendency across Latin America, not only Brazil, in the increasing delegation of powers to presidents, and also a creation of autonomous institutions, accountability institutions, autonomous prosecutors, judiciary, audit tribunals, but also central banks, electoral institutions autonomous, human rights offices that are autonomous. In Mexico, there are more than 15 autonomous institutions. So both processes take power away from legislators, right? So on the one hand, giving the legislating powers to presidents, on the other hand, taking issues outside of the legislative arena to these autonomous institutions. So I don't know if this is sustainable in the sense that in some countries we are already seeing that legislators are starting to undermine the autonomy of these institutions because they are just putting loyal members in these boards because they actually want the parties, the political parties want to make decisions on those issues. So I don't know, I mean, it's like a question slash comment. How do you see this and whether it is happening in Brazil or Europe?
May I say something to this point? I think you pointed out in a crucial moment. I think that legislatures and decided, as you said, and delegated powers to independent institutions with the expectation that those checks and balance organizations would and control the incumbent, right? So, and that's a nice equilibrium for them because, as Marcos suggested, and everybody would be better off in a competitive environment that nobody would be unchecked. The problem is that when those institutions start controlling everyone and when impose costs for all politicians regardless of who is in power and who is not in power, or independent what political party or ideological taste. So in that particular moment, we should expect reactions from legislatures trying to regain the power, right? That's exactly the moment that we have right now in Brazil. Exactly. Because by the time that only the incumbent was under and the spot, everybody was somehow pleased. But when public prosecutors, judges, start sending to jail, not only incumbents, but also legislators, for all political parties. So that became, a mess. Right? So that's it.
If I may assert something, and if you would like to check my power, then someone can. But there are a couple of people that were waiting to make comments, so I think it might be nice if we can get each of those and then give a very quick response from all of you, and then we'll only eat into the coffee hour by maybe 5 minutes total.
Well, my question regards the constraints on the legislative power, because we had a political process in Brazil that many people in Brazil call a coup, and a coup that might have happened because part of the representatives in the legislative power try to protect themselves against the judiciary. And nowadays we have a lot of evidence that a lot of money were paid to buy support from these representatives to support the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff that actually was supporting the judiciary quest against corruption. And nowadays I think that the problem is exactly that. Probably the constraints on the legislative power that are trying to somehow block the corruption probe, the Car Watch corruption probe, are much more important than the questions of the constraints on the executive power.
My question is for Professor Summerhill. You're not alone. I find your work fascinating because this period fascinating in Brazil because I have to consider why Brazil was able to capture the Portuguese empire together, the Portuguese ex-Portuguese colony together, while our Latin American neighbors just fragmented in different countries. So I want to retrieve the question posed by Professor Calheiros about federalism because at that time, during the first years of the new empire, after independence, of course, secession was a thing that was on the table. So how this fits on this bargain between taxation and there are other issues there that could kind of change the bargain at the table.
I also wanted to add just a little something for Bill. Just to link some of these things together, you move very quickly over the moment at which it was possible to put people in jail, and that's something that also is important. The current moment, the fiscal responsibility law and so forth. So I wanted to know whether the judiciary was actually in the background an important player at that moment when the king decided instead of going through that process, I'll just fire these people. Was it actually a credible threat that they would go to jail? That's just something I was curious about. There's just a yes or no answer to it. But maybe well, we have one more very quick comment, and then I'll give it to these folks for a wrap up, and then we'll get some
It's just a question to Carlos and Marcos. So basically, you portray a really kind of positive picture of public opinion, like supporting Lava Jato, right? But according to recent data, so it's a survey that Ipsos conducted last month, only 26% of Brazilians claim that they actually disagree that Lava Jato, or they disagree that Lava Jato will end up in pizza, which is kind of this term used in Brazil for like Lava Jato will fail, will fail or will end up in nothing and no convictions. So did anything change recently that would account for this change in public opinion too? Because I think if you look at the question of support for Lava Jato, public opinion supports it. So it's over 90% of people saying that they support Lava Jato. And I think there's like social observability bias going on, right? Because people wanted nobody to say that they're against Lava Jato. But when you look at people's expectations regarding the punishment, I think I have observed a change, since last year. I think people are becoming more pessimistic, and maybe their expectations are becoming, more pessimistic. And I just wanted to see how your research kind of looks at that.
The thing to do is just anybody who wants to speak up first, go ahead, but no one should take much more than 30 seconds or so because we don't want to get the whole day. A minute, whatever. We need to stop though.
So just one comment about this discussion of legislatures. There's not a generic Latin American legislature, and I think that part of the problem in Brazil is that there are weaknesses in the Brazilian Congress that are unique to Brazil that have to do with the electoral system, the fragmentation of parties, the fact that you've got like a PMDB that's just a collection of individuals that have to be individually bribed, no party discipline. So you can imagine a lot of other institutional rules that would create a different kind of legislative system that wouldn't have some of the defects and therefore the need for these checking institutions to watch over it so carefully.
Bill, there was some
so there's a judicial branch of government in the Constitution, but they don't have this constitutional review, and they don't have a role in these prosecutions and law administrative responsibility. That's all done within the lower house. So there is a judiciary, they do judicial things, but it's not these constitutional.
But could they have? You said that there were criminal punishments that were expected, and the question is there somebody who can enforce those? Was it credible that people would have gone to jail? It's one thing to have a judiciary that exists. It's another thing to have one that can actually.
They so quickly move off that possibility and transform it into a political punishment that I don't have a case where I can observe somebody simply committed from the ministry. George's question is a terrific one about federalism. Brazil's born highly centralized. It's the exact opposite of the early United States. Most of the largest area of expenditure, the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, is military. And this military expenditure, not so much for external wars in that period as it is trying to hold Brazil together. So
when you have these centripetal tendencies, you can lose a place. They lose the Cisplatina, Uruguay, but they never lose Pernambuco. They never lose the far north when you go into the bull. So it's not a predetermined outcome, but they invest lots of resources at the level of central government in maintaining this territorial integrity.
Just on your point, it's essential to the legitimacy of this counter-corruption process that it be viewed as an equal opportunity prosecution and not politically motivated. And that's hard to manage and balance.
Yeah. I don't know exactly which source you're referring in terms of support to Lava Jato, but Lava Jato has led to different operations. So you have operations in Rio. So now it's difficult to assess. I don't know which source you're referring to, but what is most important is that there has been massive convictions and support, public opinion support was crucial for that outcome. So in terms of the business class, that task is almost complete. So in a way, it's only natural that after 3 years there'd be some kind of accommodation. But I think that beliefs have been crucial up to this point. And one sentence for Julio, something that we could discuss at other times, is that at the same time that there has been this strengthening of this institution, there has been this severe weakening of the so-called parliamentary checks, by parliamentary inquiries and so on. This is my counter trend.
All right, thank you very much.